everybody, I'm Latrina Patrick. Welcome to day 10 of our 90-day grant writing tutorial. Today we will talk about the budget. It's a very simple thing but can trip a lot of people up, so I want to make sure I go over a few pointers with you so you're straight on what the expectations are when you prepare your budget. First and foremost, every grant will require that you have a budget. So whether it's a private funder or whether it's a state or federal agency, you will have to show them how you plan to use the money that you're asking for. In a federal grant, as we talked about points and how they score the grant a few days ago, we talked about this. The budget usually has fewer points than any other section. It's typically going to be about 5 points. I've seen it up to 10, but usually 5. That's not a lot when you compare it to the other components, but it really does make a difference when it gets down to the wire. As I told you guys a couple of days ago, you don't want to leave any points on the table. You want to maximize your points everywhere because this process is so competitive that every point will count and you want to get every single point you can get. So don't waste and throw away your budget points when you don't have to. Okay? So, another thing about the budget is make sure that you follow the instructions on what it is that you can ask for in that budget. You're going to have a funding announcement that's going to tell you in the state and the federal grants. They're going to be very specific. They'll tell you what kind of expenses are allowable. They'll tell you how much money you can ask for, the maximum amount you can get for your particular program, and it'll be very clear. You want to make sure you follow those to the letter because if you ask for a cent more than they say, you could literally be disqualified and your grant will never even make it to a reviewer. It's one of those pre-screening criteria that they look for before they ever pass the grant along to the reviewer. They check to make sure that you didn't exceed the maximum amount that you asked for, and people have done that. So follow your instructions and pay attention. When it comes to asking for an amount, it needs to match your narrative. Your narrative should drive your budget. So when I get to the budget, if I'm reviewing your grant, I shouldn't see any surprise request in that budget. I shouldn't all of a sudden see a van or a staff position that you haven't indicated that was a necessity or even mentioned in your program description. So you want to make sure that when we get to that budget, your narrative has justified that budget. You also want to make sure that you're asking for what you have the capacity to do. Just because a grant says the maximum amount per grant is $150,000, that doesn't mean you need to try to stretch out your grant to ask for that maximum amount. If you're a small organization, you may not even have the capacity to handle a grant that size. So don't ask for it just because it's on the table. That doesn't mean you're going to get it anyway, but it really does make you look inexperienced, and it does show throughout your grant that you're really not qualified to do what you're asking to do. So the best thing to do is ask for what it really takes to deliver your program, justify it in the narrative, and that way you know that you're doing something that you actually have the capacity to do. That looks more in your favor than just to ask for the maximum amount just because it's on the table. Even if you do ask for the maximum amount, this is the one area of the grant that is always negotiated. So regardless of what you put in your budget, once you get awarded, it's going to be negotiated. They're going to take certain things out. It never fails. So just be mindful of that. That's not a justification for you to pad it because you think they're going to knock some stuff off anyway, but they're just going to make it more realistic. So just go in there, be realistic about what your costs are. Get as close to the real cost as you can. Do your research about things. So if you're going to ask for a van for an after-school program because the kids can't get to your program without it, you're in a rural community, then find out what the cost is for a used van or whatever. But just do your homework. Include in-kind services. So if you have a situation where a school or a church or some other organization is allowing you to use their facility to hold your program at no cost to you, that's great, but you can reflect that in your budget as in-kind donation. So find out what that cost would be if they were charging someone and incorporate that into your grant. That shows community buy-in and community partners, and this is an area where you would likely get a letter of commitment from that agency who's doing that for you. So get as many realistic costs as you can. Some of the typical things that you will be able to include in your budget for most grants, some will differ, but for most grants you'll be able to include personnel. You'll be able to include the fringe benefits that go along with that if your organization pays, those types of benefits. You can put that in the grant for that particular project. A limited amount of travel. You will more than likely, if it's a federal grant or a state grant, you'll have to travel to go to, say, a grantee meeting that they always have within a couple of months after making the grant award, so you'll be able to get those costs back. You'll be able to include supplies, office supplies, a minimum amount of equipment depending on the type of grant, depending on the scale of your project. Some organizations will define equipment by certain numerical values. So for example, the feds, I think, in some types of grants, they may say if it's more than $5,000, it can't be considered equipment. So you have to know those rules and read your funding announcement to be certain of those things, because they're very clear about it, and you can be penalized if you ask for something that you're not allowed to. So be mindful of that. And if it's a smaller foundation grant or whatever, then they may not always stipulate that, but you want to know some of those basic rules of thumb so that you can stick to those, because those are the safe areas. They're going to pretty much not going to allow for a lot of travel for most grants. So don't try to put a lot of that stuff in there, but just be mindful of that. If you're not sure, always ask the program officer. There's a number on the grant that's going to tell you people you can call to get clarity about things you're uncertain about. That's what they're there for. In the big federal grants, they're going to have a programmatic person that you can call for program questions, and they'll have a different person listed for budget questions. So I encourage you to take full advantage of those resources, because that's what they're there for. Finally, the last thing you need to be mindful of with your budget is that you'll have the line item budget where you'll break down every cost, every line item, as I said, personnel, travel, supplies, materials, equipment. Then you'll also have a budget narrative that will be required. The budget narrative would be a justification of those line item costs. So for every line item that you listed, you'll have to go back in your narrative and explain that and justify it. Sometimes it's referred to as a budget narrative, sometimes it's referred to as a budget justification, but it's typically going to be included in any major grant that you pursue. So just be mindful of everything that you put in there. They're going to want you to justify that, including down to the penny of the cost, say for a particular salary. They're going to want you to tally that up and calculate the specific hours, how you break down that amount. So another tip too is when you're talking about salaries and positions like that, make sure that you pull up a salary range or a salary chart for certain positions. If you're not sure about it, you can find all kinds of stuff online for that, so that you can go back and justify why you're giving someone a particular salary, because that may come into question on occasion. Okay, so that's pretty much it about the budget. It's really simple. The best thing I can tell you is to make sure you follow the instructions. If you follow the instructions, you can't go wrong. So if you have any questions or comments about anything you've seen today, leave me a question here on my YouTube channel. That way everybody can see it and everyone will have access to the responses. While you're here, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and that way you will get immediate notification anytime I upload a new video. I also send out weekly updates about what's coming up this week in my tutorials, and I do that through my email. If you want to get those notifications, go over to my website, www.greatervisionconsulting.com, and subscribe to my email and newsletter updates, and that way you'll make sure you get my emails every Monday. As a gift to you for signing up for my email updates, I will send you a Grant Writer's Toolkit. It's a great resource. It has a template for writing a budget. It has a template for putting together a proposal. It has sample letters of support that you can send out to your community partners. And it also has some referrals and some links and some helpful websites that every new grant writer needs. So make sure you go over and sign up for that so that you can get that free gift. I hope that you have enjoyed today's session. Come back tomorrow when we will talk about what goes in the appendix. See you tomorrow.